there is something I need to confess. I hate Ulfric Stormcloak. I hate his smug potato face. I hate the stupid way he lounges on his throne. I hate his whole self-important persona. He's not only a thug, he also has all the intellect of a frost troll with a traumatic brain injury. If Ulfric has a million haters, then I am one of them. If he has only one hater, then it's me. And if he has no haters left, then don't cry for me. I'm already dead. You might be thinking, well, isn't this all a bit over the top? Some of you may believe that Ulfric had a point after all, and you aren't entirely wrong about that. Despite his failings, that is what makes him an interesting character. The characters we hate the most aren't one-dimensional villains. What makes them frustrating isn't acts of evil, but the very human failings that we all have. And in Ulfric's case, that is a very long list indeed. So today, I'll be putting Ulfric on the stand and playing the role of the prosecution. Together, we'll take a deep dive into his origins, his motivations, and his deeds. And I will aim to prove to you that not only is Ulfric dangerously misguided, but that he is a dire threat to the very land and people that he claims to champion. But first, a word from our sponsor. Not sure what you want to do with your life? Think you were made for something better? Then you should consider joining the Imperial Legion. Be the sword of the Emperor, the shield of the innocent, and the hammer that smashes evil in all its forms. And don't worry, you don't need to be an Imperial to join. We'll take anyone. Really, if you have 2 arms and a pulse, that's good enough for us. So text SEPTIM to 0900 9999. That's SEPTIM to 0900 9999. Now, back to the video. Relatively little is known of Ulfric's early life, but what we do know paints an interesting picture and helps to explain the man he would eventually become. Born the son of Hogue Stormcloak, the Jarl of Windhelm, as a child he was sent to High Hrothgar to train under the Greybeards, a rare honour granted only to those with an exceptional gift for the voice. Had he remained there, perhaps history would remember him not as a rebel or a warlord, but as a sage, a wise figure who could help shape Skyrim's destiny with words instead of bloodshed. But of course, patience and humility were never Ulfric's strong suits. Although he spent 10 years on High Hrothgar and had great respect for the ways of the voice, he abandoned his training before mastering the Greybeard's teachings, choosing to fight for the Empire in the Great War. This is a crucial moment in understanding Ulfric's character. Here we see an early idealism, his belief that he is an agent of destiny, fated to play a great role on the stage of history. This is all we know for certain about Ulfric's early days, but from the sparse details, a few assumptions can be made. Though no siblings are ever mentioned, it seems likely that he was not his father's only heir. After all, it would be foolish for one of the great Jarls to allow their only son to go and live with the hermits on High Hrothgar, let alone throw themselves into the front lines of a losing war. It's not a stretch then to assume that young Ulfric had brothers or sisters who may have died at an early age, perhaps killed in the Great War, or finished off by one of the myriad dangers that plagued Tamriel. Such an event would have surely hardened the young warrior, helping to cement the man he would later become. But there is another aspect of his early life we should not overlook, namely, the ways in which Ulfric's journey mirrors that of his hero, Talos. Both spent their formative years in Skyrim. Both were called to the throat of the world by the Greybeards. Both fought for the Empire. Not only would this deepen Ulfric's devotion to his patron god, but it would also serve a propagandistic purpose, casting him in the role as the true heir of Talos in the place of the shattered Empire. This brings us to Ulfric's role in the Great War, and for all his flaws, it cannot be said that he did not serve honourably. Like many young Nords, he answered the Empire's call to arms when the Altmiri Dominion invaded Cyrodiil, believing in the righteousness of the cause. And for a while, it seemed that the Empire still had a chance to repel the Dominion's forces. But soon, the war began to turn against the Imperials, and the Elven forces marched against the White Gold Tower. And, in the chaos, Ulfric himself would fall prisoner to the Thalmor. As a prisoner of war, Ulfric endured terrible suffering. He was tortured, broken down both physically and mentally. He was not alone in this. Many Imperial soldiers suffered the same fate, but for Ulfric, a proud warrior and the son of a Jarl, it must have been a special kind of hell. The Thalmor knew exactly how to break him. They didn't just torment his body, they undermined his sense of purpose, his very identity. He was handed over to Elenwen, the Thalmor agent who would later become the first emissary to Skyrim. She mocked him, telling him that the information he had given up was crucial to the capture of the Imperial City. Though this was an insidious lie, it left Ulfric racked with guilt, a shell of his former self. Then one day he escaped, or rather, he was allowed to. He returned home, not just a survivor of the war, but a man consumed by bitterness. And, as the war ended with the signing of the White Gold Concordat, Ulfric came to believe that it was all for nothing. From a distance, it seems obvious that the Empire's legions were exhausted, and the Emperor had little choice but to agree to the treaty. But in Ulfric's eyes, the Empire had betrayed Skyrim. In particular, the agreement to outlaw Talos worship and allow the Thalmor's agents to root out his followers was anathema to many Nords, not least Ulfric. And so, his anger turned towards the Empire that he believed had betrayed him. It's not hard to see why Ulfric became the man he did. The horrors of war, the humiliation of captivity, the bitterness of betrayal, it could have broken anyone. But where some might have sought to rebuild, to forge a new way forward, Ulfric chose a darker path. His pride, which once drove him to fight for his people, had turned into something far more dangerous, and all of Skyrim would suffer for it. After the Great War ended, Ulfric soon threw himself into another conflict, this time against the Reachmen. For centuries, the Reachmen had lived as second-class citizens in their own homeland, rankling under the rule of the Nordic Jarls of Markarth. Then, in the chaos of the Great War, the Reachmen seized their opportunity. They retook the city of Markarth and declared their own independent kingdom. The Empire, exhausted from fighting the Altmeri Dominion, was in no position to do anything about it. But, to the Nords of Skyrim, this was an unacceptable humiliation. In their eyes, the Reach was Nordic soil, and the Reachmen were little more than savages. Yet despite the vilification of the Reachmen, it seems that this upstart kingdom was an oasis of relative peace in a turbulent time. That is, until Ulfric Stormcloak arrived. Hrolfdir, the deposed Jarl of Markarth, approached Ulfric to lead a militia to take back the city. Under Ulfric's command, the Nords stormed the gates of Markarth, driving the Reachmen from the city and putting their leader Madanach in chains. But Ulfric's victory came at a bitter price. As Imperial scholar Arianus Arius recalls, what happened during that battle was war, but what happened after the battle was over is nothing short of war crimes. Every official who worked for the Forsworn was put to the sword, even after they had surrendered. Native women were tortured to give up names of Forsworn fighters who had fled the city or were in the hills of the Reach. Anyone who lived in the city, Forsworn and Nord alike, were executed if they had not fought with Ulfric and his men when they breached the gates. "You are with us, or you are against Skyrim," was the message on Ulfric's lips, as he ordered the deaths of shopkeepers, farmers, the elderly, and any child old enough to lift a sword that had failed in the call to fight with him. As the dust settled, it became clear that this was little more than a purge, and before the blood was even dry, Ulfric had one final demand. Markarth should be free to worship Talos once more. Desperate to maintain order, Hrolfdir agreed. But once the Thalmor found out, they were far from amused. They sent a contingent to Markarth, demanding Ulfric's arrest for violating the White Gold Concordat. With little alternative, Jarl Hrolfdir agreed, and Ulfric was clapped in irons. Ulfric blamed the Emperor personally for this betrayal, and his hatred of the Empire continued to fester. But we have to ask, what else did he expect? Like it or not, the Empire was still bound by the White Gold Concordat, and was not yet ready for another open war with the Dominion. And it seems that Ulfric only made things worse for Talos worshippers, not better. There was already a shrine to Talos in the city, and it's likely that his followers were quietly worshipping him below the radar. But by breaking the treaty, Ulfric would only attract the full attention of the Thalmor onto the city's Talos worshippers. Yet another example of how Ulfric harms the causes he claims to believe in. In the end, the Markarth incident didn't just destabilise the Reach, it helped to push Skyrim closer to the brink of civil war. The Forsworn, radicalised by Ulfric's slaughter, would launch an endless campaign of revenge against the Nords. The Thalmor, watching from the shadows, took note of the growing fractures, and Ulfric, instead of seeing the bigger picture, doubled down, convinced more than ever that the Empire had to be driven from Skyrim. After Ulfric's imprisonment, he was released back to Windhelm, where he took his recently deceased father's place as Jarl. This was his chance to prove himself, not just as a warrior, but as a ruler. And, to give credit where it's due, Ulfric did inspire fierce loyalty among many of Windhelm's Nordic citizens. To them, he was a war hero, a man who had defied the Empire and the Thalmor both. His people saw him as a true son of Skyrim, someone who would fight to restore their nation's honour. And, to some extent, he succeeded. After all, enough men and women believed in him to take up arms in rebellion. That kind of devotion is no small feat. Yet leading a war is one thing, leading in peace is another entirely, and Ulfric's rule in Windhelm came at a heavy cost. Windhelm was not a united city, it was a fractured one, and he only further entrenched its divides. His defiance of the Empire came hand in hand with stoking racial tensions, creating an us and them mentality that left entire populations neglected and alienated. The Grey Quarter, home to Windhelm's Dunmer refugees, was a crumbling slum, ignored by the very man who spoke so passionately about freedom. Many Dark Elves fled Morrowind after the cataclysm of the Red Year, seeking sanctuary in Skyrim, only to find themselves treated as second-class citizens. Ulfric could have chosen to include them in his vision of an independent Skyrim. Remember that historically, the Dunmer have had little love for the Empire, but he dismissed their suffering with the excuse that they did not fight for his cause, forgetting, of course, that he had given them little reason to. The Argonians fared even worse. They weren't just mistreated, they were outright barred from entering the city, confined to the docks as if there was some sort of invasive species. This was Ulfric's vision of freedom, one in which only the right sort of person deserved it. His rule did not bring the city together, it drove a wedge between its people, making it a place where only one vision of Skyrim truly belonged. Brunwulf Freewinter, a resident of Windhelm and a Nord veteran of the Great War, sums up this xenophobia quite bluntly. If Ulfric had his way, anyone who wasn't a Nord would be shipped right out of Skyrim. Granted, Ulfric had the devotion of his followers, but that loyalty was built on the hatred and fear of others, and a Skyrim under his rule would be a smaller, sorrier, more narrow-minded place. As Ulfric's rule in Windhelm continued, tensions between Skyrim and the Empire began to boil over. Ulfric had already made his stance on the Empire quite clear, and his resentment had been simmering for years. But rather than trying to build alliances or appeal to High King Torrig's better nature, Ulfric chose a far more direct and dishonourable path. One day, Ulfric arrived in Solitude, home of the High King and the imperial seat of power in Skyrim. According to Solitude's court wizard, Sibyl Stentor, Torrig initially believed Ulfric had come to call for a moot, a traditional Nord assembly where Jarls debate the future of Skyrim. But by the time it became clear that Ulfric intended to challenge him to a duel, Torrig had no choice but to accept. Refusing would have destroyed his reputation. No Nord would willingly have a coward as their king. This deception might be forgivable, if not for the way Ulfric conducted himself in the duel. He had no intention of fighting fairly. Instead, he used the voice to completely annihilate Torrig. Eyewitnesses describe the young king as being shouted apart, his body torn to pieces before their very eyes. In Nord culture, a duel is meant to be an honourable contest of arms. This is a complete mockery of that, the metaphorical equivalent of bringing a gun to a boxing match. Bear in mind, even if Ulfric had fought conventionally, he would still have held every advantage. By this point, he was a hardened war veteran, trained in combat and battle-tested against the Dominion. Torrig, by contrast, was barely more than a boy. He had never fought in a real battle, and had likely never swung a blade in anger. If Ulfric had truly wanted to prove himself the better warrior, he could have simply bested Torrig through sheer skill. But that wasn't enough. Ulfric needed to make a spectacle. His ego demanded that the world see his power, that he be feared and respected. In truth, this wasn't a duel, it was murder, nothing more. And the greatest tragedy? Torrig may have actually sympathised with Ulfric's cause. Sybil Stentor recalls that during the moot which named Torrig as High King, Ulfric had been lobbying for Skyrim's independence. She states, "I don't think Ulfric knew how much Torrig respected him for that. If Ulfric had asked Torrig directly to stand up, to declare independence, Torrig might have done it. But that was never enough for Ulfric. He didn't really want an independent Skyrim, he just wanted to rule it." With the High King dead, Skyrim was thrown into chaos, and Ulfric had his excuse to raise his banners. The Stormcloak Rebellion had begun. As the battle lines were drawn, the Jarls of Skyrim were divided between Ulfric and the Empire. Ulfric painted himself as a liberator, the great champion who would free Skyrim from the Empire's yoke and restore its past glories. But in reality, his rebellion was a folly, not only reckless, but actively undermining the very cause he had dedicated his life to. Far from securing Skyrim's future, Ulfric's war sent it down the path of death and ruin. Although Ulfric had plenty ideas of how to win the war, it seems he had little actual plan for ruling Skyrim. His grand vision seems to stop at defeating the Empire, but what comes next? How would Skyrim function as an independent state? Would he establish a new government with its own institutions? Or would he just rebrand the imperial institutions already in place? There's little indication he's given serious thought to it. By claiming the title of High King through might of arms, Ulfric is clearly hearkening back to the traditional ways of the Nords. Perhaps his plan is to rebuild a state based on the Nordic Empire of old. But this notion is little more than fantasy. That was thousands of years ago, and Skyrim has been an integral part of the Empire for centuries. Its culture and institutions have changed drastically in that time. Attempting to return to a fabled golden age seems more of an exercise in nostalgia than an actual political policy. And of course, we have to consider the boring practicalities which come with forming a new state. A newly independent Skyrim would need allies, trade agreements, a military, a currency. Instead, Ulfric was plunging the province into chaos without so much as a roadmap. In theory, independence sounds bold and noble, until you realise that Ulfric had no infrastructure to support it. He was so focused on winning the throne that he neglected the more important question: what happens the day after victory? A true leader unites their people, but Ulfric has a long track record of doing the opposite. His war didn't just pit Imperials against Stormcloaks, it tore Skyrim in half, pitting brother against brother, father against son. For Ulfric, the road to power would be paved with bodies, and not those of foreign invaders, but of the men and women he is supposedly sworn to protect. Many of the Nords who opposed him, including people like Jarl Balgruuf, did so not because they loved the Empire, but because they saw him for what he was, a man prioritizing his own ambition over his homeland's well-being. Ulfric's war was not a heroic stand against oppression. It was a brutal struggle that left Skyrim weaker, bloodied, and unstable. Even if he had won, half of Skyrim would have still despised him. His free Skyrim would have been anything but united. And even if Ulfric miraculously won without further bloodshed, an independent Skyrim would have been economically and militarily crippled. Skyrim relied on the Empire for trade, infrastructure, and resources. Who was going to fill that gap? In the Fourth Era, Skyrim was far from an economic powerhouse. It's a largely feudal agricultural economy, one that would struggle to flourish in isolation, and one that would certainly be unable to match the might and the wealth of the Altmeri Dominion. And that's not even considering the military situation. Ulfric's kingdom would be practically encircled by hostile powers. The Imperials to the south, the Dark Elves to the east, and the ever-present threat of the Dominion on the horizon. Yes, the Empire may have signed the White Gold Concordat, but it was the only thing standing between Skyrim and the Thalmor. The Stormcloaks claim to be breaking their chains, but they're only setting themselves up for a trap. Skyrim, alone and under Ulfric's rule, would have no fleet, no standing army, and little prospect of winning in the long run. This leads us to the final crushing irony. Ulfric's rebellion did more for the Thalmor than it ever did for Skyrim. The Dominion's greatest enemy is a strong, united empire. The longer that Ulfric's war dragged on, the weaker the empire became, forcing it to divert troops, gold, and resources to Skyrim, instead of preparing them for the next war with the Dominion. There's an old adage in war: divide and conquer. With the Imperials and the Nords at each other's throats, all the Thalmor need to do is watch and wait. Then they can come for the human realms one by one, digesting them in little pieces until all of Tamriel was under their tyranny. Of all the accusations levelled against Ulfric, none are as damning or as controversial as the claim that he was a Thalmor agent. This brings us to the infamous Thalmor dossier, a classified document detailing his status as a Thalmor asset. It reveals that Ulfric was allowed to escape from Thalmor captivity during the Great War, allowing him to return to Skyrim as a radicalised, vengeful figure. The Thalmor saw his potential and cultivated him as an asset, particularly in the lead-up to the Markarth incident, which they described as particularly valuable from the point of view of their strategic goals. By the time of Skyrim's civil war, Ulfric was no longer cooperating with the Thalmor, but that didn't matter, because he was still working in their interest, consciously or not. As long as the war dragged on, Skyrim would remain weak, divided, and vulnerable. The Dominion's strategy was simple but brilliant. Let the Stormcloaks and the Empire bleed each other dry. The dossier explicitly states, as long as the civil war proceeds in its current indecisive fashion, we should remain hands-off. The incident at Helgen is an example where an exception had to be made. Obviously, Ulfric's death would have dramatically increased the chance of an Imperial victory, and thus harmed our overall position in Skyrim. Let that sink in for a moment. The Thalmor sent their agents to Helgen to actually prevent Ulfric's death, not because they wanted him to win, but because his continued rebellion was too valuable to lose. The fact that the intervention of a dragon allowed Ulfric to escape was merely a coincidence. All along, Ulfric was just a pawn in a larger game he didn't even understand, one the Dominion was playing with cold, calculated precision. This shows the true folly of Ulfric Stormcloak, a useful idiot, a fool so consumed by his own ambition that he never realised who was pulling the strings. Ulfric Stormcloak is not the hero that Skyrim needs. He is not the second coming of Talos, not the noble warrior king who will lead his people to glory. He is a man consumed by vengeance and bitterness, blinded by his own ambition, utterly incapable of seeing the bigger picture. His rebellion is not a fight for freedom, it's a reckless gamble that risks dooming Skyrim to ruin. The Empire is flawed. It's weak, on the brink of ruin, a shell of its former self. But it is also the only force standing between Tamriel and complete Dominion control. If Ulfric wins, Skyrim will stand alone, fractured and bleeding from a civil war it can barely afford. And the Thalmor, who have already used him once, will be waiting. The Empire might be on its knees, but the secession of Skyrim would be a killing blow. And Skyrim, as an independent state, exhausted and isolated, would be easy prey for the Dominion. This is the truth Ulfric refuses to see. His rebellion does not make Skyrim stronger, it fractures it. His war does not defy the Thalmor, it serves their purposes. Whether he knows it or not, he is doing their dirty work by tearing the Empire apart from within. Skyrim deserves better. Better than Ulfric, better than the Empire even. It deserves a leader who can unite its people, not divide them. But for now, survival means standing together, not breaking apart. The true battle is not between the Empire and the Stormcloaks, it's between the Dominion and the free peoples of Tamriel. And if there is to be any hope of winning that war, Ulfric Stormcloak must lose this one. Thank you for watching. Please like and subscribe if you'd like to see more videos on the Elder Scrolls, and feel free to let me know your opinion in the comments. And until next time, wealth beyond measure.